EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richman. The National Awards for Education Reporting recognizes the country's best beat reporter with the Moskowitz Prize. This year's recipient is Talia Richman of the Dallas Morning News. Judges praised both the breadth and scope of her reporting, her knack for finding interesting sources and storytelling, but always keeping her eye on the big picture, which is making sure her readers understood what was really happening in education in the great state of Texas. She joins us now. Talia, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me and for that kind introduction.
You got to accept your award at EWA's National Seminar in Las Vegas, but this is the first chance that you and I have had a chance since that emotional high, I would say. Were you surprised when they called your name?
I was completely surprised. Like I mentioned at the conference, there are so many education reporters who go to EWA that I'm just such a huge fan of, that I derive so much inspiration from, and I could think of 100 people who probably deserved this award. So for it to go to me, I was completely humbled and so honored.
Can you give us an idea, when we talk about beat reporting, the size and scale of your particular beat for the Dallas Morning News?
Yeah, so it's both a blessing and a curse to be an education beat reporter in the state of Texas, where there is so much going on that demands our attention. Schools and education is one of the biggest stories down here. Luckily, we have a great press corps, but I do sometimes feel like, wow, I could be covering so many different things down here on the education beat. We try to stick to stories in the North Texas region, and we look for districts and schools that tell a specific story about what's going on there, but tell a broader story, a broader trend. But, my beat is anything from what is going on at the Dallas ISD school board meeting this Thursday to what's upcoming in the legislature to, what trends are happening related to school discipline and reading curriculum, everything in between.
You do a fair amount of enterprise reporting in addition to the nuts and bolts of the beat. How do you carve out time for that?
I try to do, one thing a day that chips away at the bigger story. So that might be shooting off a PIR, a public information request, or scheduling a source building coffee. I'm really upfront with my editor about the big stories that are coming, and she really encourages me to pursue the big fish, not just the small potatoes. And I think I just try to be as open with her as possible. Like, hey, I have this great idea. It's going to require that XYZ is on the back burner, but here's what I think it could do for us. So I think having that open line of communication while also chipping away at things is my big strategy.
Did you find your work processes changed a lot during the pandemic? And did any of those behaviors, I don't know, there can't really be a silver lining to a pandemic, but did you find yourself rethinking how you approach some of that, the scale and the scope?
Yeah, I think before the pandemic, I would never have even considered going to a school board meeting virtually. That was during a time when school board meetings were more quote unquote boring, but I loved them so much. I loved sitting in the back with the various moms who were knitting and advocates who'd been coming for 20 years and just overhearing all that stuff. During the pandemic, of course, so many meetings went virtual. And I think in a way that let me be in two places at once sometimes. If one meeting was in closed session, I could pop over to a different board or a different body that I needed to be keeping an eye on. So I think I've made some use out of things going virtual. So as much as I miss sometimes sitting in the back in person, I think there's a way to kind of multiply your time now.
I think a lot of people would say that, the practical sort of outweighs what your personal preference might be. And certainly still showing up in person, there's not a lot of substitutes for that, but you're juggling a lot of balls.
Totally. Yeah, I think my favorite stories come from just one-off sentence someone utters at a school board meeting. It's almost like a game. Like, how can I find the most interesting story that just was, muttered under someone's breath? So I still like to do that as much as possible while, recognizing the reality of staffing in American newspapers.
One of your biggest stories, and I would say one of the most interesting over the past year, was about a middle schooler named Madison. And she did exactly what the adults in her life had been telling her to do pretty much all of her life, especially in school. And that was, if she saw something, she was supposed to say something. For our listeners who may not know this story, have may not read it or had a chance to hear the audio version, tell us a little bit about these circumstances.
Yeah, the story was about a 13-year-old girl named Madison. She was in gym class one day and she overheard a boy say the phrase, "Don't come to school tomorrow," to another kid. And, this is a kid who's been raised through constant school shootings. Sandy Hook was when she was just a little kid, and Parkland, then Uvalde when, she was a middle schooler herself. So those words stuck with her. And she decided she was going to warn a couple friends in a group chat, kind of bounce the idea, like, what do you think this could mean? Am I crazy? Like, does this mean that he's going to bring a gun to school? And then she told her mom. They ultimately tried to report it to the school and make sure that Madison and her classmates would be safe the next day. Ultimately, there was no threat to campus, but Madison ended up being punished. The school determined she had made a false accusation about school safety, and they tried to send her to alternative school for the entire rest of 8th grade, 73 days. Her mom was a fierce advocate and said, this doesn't seem right. She fought it. She dug into the research around racial disparities in discipline. Madison and her mother are Black. And, the story ended up being not just about Madison's case, but about the ways that schools can respond to school shooting threats by instituting zero tolerance policies. It was about those racial disparities in discipline data and just, the effect on kids when they are constantly confronted with the possibility of a shooter coming to their campus.
There's so many layers to this story. And as you said, it's not just about what are the school policies and how are they carried out. But I felt like you really explored some of the societal and institutional racism that was underpinning it. Even in Madison's mom being a fierce advocate, realizing she had to temper her passion for her child with these stereotypes of the angry Black woman swooping in. And to try to counter that, she had to work forcefully against that. And I thought one of the most painful moments in your story wasn't necessarily Madison being suspended or being sent to this alternative school, but it was when Madison realized that all of these adults in the room were judging her in a particular way and weren't actually necessarily on her side. I thought that was really painful.
Yeah, and I think it was, so many of the sources, Black women who are lawyers and civil rights advocates that I called for the story, they could remember that moment in their lives too. So it was incredible what Madison was able to talk about and emote about as a 13-year-old about these really big feelings. And yeah, Lisa, her mother, was so cognizant of the way that she sounded. Lisa is like source of the century. She recorded all of her interactions with the school, with lawyers, everything, and was willing to give those to me. Texas is a one-party consent state, so this was a legal and wonderful thing for her to do. And I was so struck listening to those recordings of just how measured her voice was at all times. Like, I couldn't have done that, even as a reporter, I don't think. I think if you listen to my interviews, with the school, I'd be like, no, like, go back. Like, I don't understand. Please give me an explanation on this. But Lisa never once lost her cool. And it was really incredible to hear.
Well, let's talk about big phone calls. What does it sound like when your phone rings and it's This American Life calling
Oh my gosh.
saying, we want to turn your story into radio? What happened? How did that happen?
Oh, it was so exciting. I'm such a huge fan of This American Life. And, some of their education stories in particular, like Hannah Jaffe-Walt, I listened to her series 3 Miles, like probably once a year as like a personal ritual to feel like I'm rooting my education stories in equity and humanity like she does. So I was a huge fan of the show. And I knew one of the producers, Chris Benderev. He used to work on a different podcast, and he did a series on the Capitol, the newspaper in Annapolis. Its reporters and staff were victims of a mass shooting, and Chris has always done really powerful work on shootings and telling stories about them on the radio. And so he, as now a producer at This American Life, was interested in doing kind of less typical gun violence stories. So he had come across my article and realized, oh, we knew each other because I had talked to him as kind of a background source for his previous podcast. And I was just instantly like, how can we make this happen? Because Lisa and Madison, they were, I think, really grateful for the Dallas Morning News story, but part of what they wanted to do was really create a national conversation about these issues. And I knew This American Life would be the way they could do it. And so they were on board instantly. The Dallas Morning News was on board instantly. It was really exciting.
What did you learn from that process about moving from the print version of the story? I'm sure a lot of new doors, windows, lights came on, ideas. What changed for you there?
I learned so much about how to describe someone to their essence. When you're on the radio, you don't have photos, you don't have like flowery descriptions of what someone can look like that go on for a paragraph. Like we really had to be looking for the details that instantly hooked the listener into who Madison and Lisa were. So I think that was such a great lesson that I've tried to carry forward in my other feature writing since then, of just like, what are the most salient key details that will instantly tell a reader, a listener, everything they need to know. I'm also like kind of a research wonk, and I love linking to studies about adultification bias and racial disparities in discipline. Like I love all those reports and research briefs, and turns out that will put people to sleep if you read them long paragraphs about data on the radio, as maybe you know from doing this podcast. And so it got me to really focus on, okay, what am I actually trying to say? What is the takeaway people really need to know? And how do I lead them there in simple, conversational, clear terms?
We're talking with Talia Richman of the Dallas Morning News, named the nation's top education beat reporter in this year's National Awards for Education Reporting. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you very much to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on Apple's podcast. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. Talia, I want to turn for a moment to your journalism origin story. Did you always want to be a reporter?
I wanted to be a ballerina when I was very young, and then pretty instantly it became reporter. I joined my high school newspaper staff and basically never looked back.
Interesting. Did you study journalism in college?
Yes, at the University of Maryland, where I also got a great education at the Diamondback, the student newspaper there.
But you grew up in Dallas, so you've gone back home to cover the community where you used to be a student. What's that like?
It's pretty awesome, honestly. Like, I did not expect so many teachers and other staff from the school that I graduated from to remember that I used to bug them for interviews when I was 16 and, find my Dallas Morning News address and offer me tips that way. It's been really lovely reporting on the school district that I graduated from. I feel like I just have a sense of, I want to do this right. I know these people and I know this community and I want to be fair. And yeah, I feel like getting those sources right away was excellent.
What's changed in the district since you were there, in terms of policy or practice? How different does the school operations seem to you?
The district has just continued to grow more diverse and take on equity in a more powerful way than it did when I was there. And I think that's been really gratifying to see. It's a district where I think you can really evaluate equity policies well because it is diverse. There's a large sample size of different demographics that you can really evaluate. So I've focused some of my solution stories there in addition to, writing when things go wrong, because I'm like, hey, you can see through data here what could be going well. Of course, just because they're my school district, I'm not going to give them a fair pass. But I do think they are in some ways willing to do those confrontational interviews because I remind them, like, hey, I learned this in room beef 214 at Richardson High School. Like, I'm coming at it from an ethical point of view.
That's a pretty good ace in the hole to be able to pull out of your wallet. Talia, what I appreciated about your reporting, and this was something noted by the judges for the Moskowitz Prize, was that sometimes you take readers up to 30,000 feet, for example, to explain about school choice and Governor Abbott's efforts to push through these education savings account. But then you take us down into the ground level, into a Christian school, to show your readers what those dollars would actually be paying for.
Yeah, that story, I teamed up with one of our Austin reporters, Allie Morris, who's now an editor. And we knew that everything with vouchers was so rooted in schools, but also so rooted in politics. And you couldn't disentwine them. You couldn't pretend that this was just about education when really it was about campaigns and about a national stage and about what it means to be a Republican and a conservative. But we never wanted to run stories that just took place in the legislature and didn't have real parents. So when Greg Abbott was doing this kind of parent empowerment tour, he was calling it, we knew we had to go there. We had to talk to the parents, the ones who were seeking that empowerment he was talking about, and also the ones who were outside protesting and carrying signs in support of their own public schools. So I think with those stories, talking to as many people as possible, which is, ideally what I do for every story, but just making sure that we didn't just talk to the principal and get the platitudes about what education savings accounts or vouchers would do for his school, but let's read all of your policies. Let's read all about your admissions rules, looking for patterns. We got the list of every school that Greg Abbott was visiting and tried to look for the similarities. These were not Catholic schools. These were not Jewish schools. These were not Muslim schools. These were a very specific Christian school. Many of them, not all, but many of them had tuitions that cost more than what an ESA would have provided, at least that iteration of an ESA. And many of them had admissions that were quite selective, even requiring like a signature from a religious leader or a recommendation from a religious leader. So kind of what we talked about earlier, we were always looking for those bigger picture patterns and how to make that feel really real to people.
We talked earlier about the impact of the pandemic, and one thing we've been hearing from education journalists across the country is that schools that closed to reporters in a lot of ways just simply haven't reopened. It's very difficult to get access. How would you describe your access level?
My biggest thing when I'm trying to get access in schools is explaining why it matters. I think, especially as education reporters, I see my role as a media ambassador in some ways, especially for little kids, for teachers and principals. We're often like the first reporter they interact with. They don't know the rules of the media and they don't know why me sitting in their class for 2 hours matters. So I think like I do my best to explain like the reason I want to sit in your class is I think that I can show XYZ better if I get to be a fly on the wall. Like, for example, the story I did that was in my beat reporting packet about advanced math. Like, I don't know how I would have done that story if I couldn't hang out in the school. That is what made it come to life. Otherwise, it's a research brief. And I think telling that to people is very important, demystifying our process. Like, this works for you. This is what I'm going to accomplish. This is what I need and why.
For our listeners, that story was about a new policy in the Dallas School District where they were testing out sort of a pilot program to automatically place children in honors math based on their test scores versus teachers' recommendation, which could reveal unintentional or selective bias, right?
Yeah. At its simplest, it's an opt-out form instead of an opt-in.
Fantastic. And that program got a lot of attention because of your story. It's now going to be replicated in some other places. So your stories obviously have a lot of impact. Sometimes it's something like that where something gets amplified. In other cases, potentially legislation gets shaped or impacted. Is there something that you kind of think about? And I know it's hard, Talia. I'm asking you to brag on yourself a little bit, but that's this episode's about. Gotta lean into it. Is there something that you're exceptionally proud of where there was impact? And maybe it's something that we don't know about yet.
Lisa and Madison's story, I think, had a very large impact in the school district. They changed their discipline policies to have extra oversight to make sure there was not discriminatory patterns at play. And I think that was an action that had a lot of impact. And I think, too, I remember this when I was a kid, like being told that like your voice mattered was like such an incredible feeling. And like the fact that I felt like our story could give that to Madison after she had been treated in a difficult way by her school, you could tell what it did to her confidence, her mom told me. And that is something I really treasure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about voices. I mean, sometimes the sources for stories choose us, but many times we choose them. So, what's your approach to source diversity? How do you kind of audit your own professional practices and make sure underrepresented voices are being heard?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we talk about at the beginning of the reporting process and not at the end. Like I'd feel ashamed if I got to the end of a story and was filing it to Eva and she pointed out to me like, hey, it looks like you only have one type of voice in here. Dallas, North Texas, Texas as a whole, it's a very diverse state. And so it is incumbent on us to not feature the same types of voices over and over and over again. So that's a constant conversation that we're having with Eva, my editor, with the photo team, just internally. I know a lot of people who do the audits at the end, and I think that's a great idea of tracking. It's not something I've done yet, but I should add it to my practices. But for me, it's really at the very beginning, we're thinking about that. If we're at a rally like the one at the private school that Greg Abbott is holding, I'm not only just going up to white parents. Why would I do that? And I'm also not just going up to the supporters, I'm going up to the people who are protesting. So just making sure in my reporting process and getting as many views as possible.
Checking my math, it's been about 7 years for you on the beat.
Yes, that's correct. About 3 years in Baltimore, 1 year where I had to go on City Hall, and then about 3 years here in Dallas, back on my favorite beat.
No offense to City Hall, folks. All of our City
it's
Hall
fine.
listeners, you may want to, they want to just fast forward the podcast about 4 seconds. Well, I'm wondering, what advice would you have for a brand new education reporter just starting on the beat? Maybe somebody picking it up this fall.
There are so many stories that can be done on this beat. And I remember when I was new, I was overwhelmed by just how many directions that I could go and how many directions I could take this, and just freaking out if I missed a single update from a school board meeting, or if a competitor had a story, like it would just send me spiraling. And I had a mentor who, I'm not sure where the origin of, I'm sure it's from a TV show or something, but gave me this advice that like stories are like taxi cabs. And if you miss one, there's another one coming around the corner and you just got to take it. And so I think just being really intentional about what your buckets are, like what are you going to own? For the past couple of years, I've gone really hard at teacher quality. And I couldn't have done some of these stories if I hadn't let other ones slide. I had to take time to learn these data skills that let me expose how many uncertified teachers were being hired in the state. And that meant someone else got a different story that was also excellent, but I could develop this area of expertise. And that's hard, but really taking stock of where you can have the most impact, I think is important. And then this is advice I usually give when I talk to student reporters, but I think it is applicable to new to the beat people too. I think like your status as a young reporter, and I'm still pretty young, I think, people want to help. Like everyone who has gotten anywhere on this beat has received mentorship and friendship and an outstretched hand from someone who was at it a little bit longer than them. And I think especially on a beat as collegial and collaborative as an education beat, I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to someone that you admire and ask them to shadow edit your top, or point you to a direction of data, or just like jump on the phone for 20 minutes and talk you through something. If someone has ever done that to me and I didn't respond, like it was because maybe I was out of town and they should email me again. But like, I think people want to help each other because they themselves can point to 1 million people who have helped them. So I think like not being shy about reaching out to the people you admire for help.
That's great advice, Talia. Talia is a reporter for the Dallas Morning News Education Lab, and she is also the newly minted winner of the Moskowitz Prize, recognizing the best education beat reporter in the country. Talia, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a reporter or a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 77 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.